can still remember the very first time that I celebrated Martin Luther King Day at a black church. Now, I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, and it was not until high school that I had the experience of celebrating Martin Luther King Day in an African American church. I was invited to attend the service by one of my mom's friends from college. She was a remarkable woman. She was a white woman, grew up in the Midwest, and became a teacher of African American studies at Iowa State University. I think perhaps because she was a lesbian, she could identify with the struggle of civil rights that was sweeping our nation during the 60s and 70s, and she found that she was welcomed into the African American community as an advocate. And she wanted to share with me this experience. So on a Monday, that was Martin Luther King Day when I was in high school, we drove across the city to a part of the city that I had never been to. And it was January, so I remember it was pretty cold. But once we got to this church, First Corinthian Baptist Church, we walked inside. We got there a little bit early, about 20 minutes early, and yet the church was already packed. We had to kind of cram into a pew. We would have been right about back there in the pew, and we crammed into an aisle, and the people were already singing. They weren't just singing, but they were swaying. And I could start to get into the spirit, and it felt like we were in a surround sound theater. There were the booming basses, there were the tenacious tenors, there were the angelic altos and sopranos, with their voices soaring like the angels. And it wasn't just the choir, it was the whole congregation, lifting up songs so soulful that they could move your spirit. I remember that. Songs so powerful that it felt like there was hope for a better world. They could take a simple song that to me seemed like a Sunday school song and turn it into an anthem for liberation. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Now that's a song filled with the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King. So imagine what it must have felt like for Dr. King when he came and spoke from this pulpit in 1961. He was coming to a community in Woodland Hills, which even to this day, if you haven't noticed, this is a mostly white community. Imagine what it must have been like in 1961 when black people were not even allowed to buy a home in this community because the real estate association banded together to keep them from purchasing homes. And Dr. King came to this church as a minority. And yet, he brought a message of hope and encouragement to the majority, everyone who was gathered in this church. Dr. King gave a sermon which was one of his popular sermons that he shared many times throughout his life about the three dimensions of a complete life. And I'd like to share the thesis from his sermon. Dr. King shared that life should be strong and complete on every side. Any complete life has three dimensions: length, breadth, and height. The length of life is the inward drive to achieve one's personal ends and ambitions, and an inward concern for one's welfare and achievements. Today we might speak of the length of life as healthy self-esteem, or perhaps self-care, loving yourself. Next, Dr. King writes that the breadth of life is the outward concern for the welfare of others. The breadth of life could be considered community service. It could be advocacy for justice. It could be dedicating yourself to the care for others. And finally, the height of life is the upward reach towards God. Dr. King writes, life is at best a coherent triangle. At one angle is the individual person, at the other angle are other persons, and at the tip top, the infinite person, God. So this was Dr. King's vision that he shared with this community. And in sharing this message, he was continuing the tradition of Paul the Evangelist. When Paul wrote in today's text about the charismatic gifts, he was talking about gifts that can be used to serve and build the church. Gifts of healing, gifts of deep faith, gifts of speaking with wisdom and understanding, speaking in tongues, which could also mean speaking in multiple languages, as we saw the welcome today in multiple languages. And those who can interpret multiple languages are also lifting up the church. Now, Paul was writing about these gifts which sometimes were used more to elevate an individual who was considered to be gifted than they were to serve the church. So Paul was encouraging all of us to recognize that with the many gifts that we have, we should put those for the service of the greater good. And I believe that that's what Dr. Martin Luther King did with his prophetic gifts. Dr. King was blessed with an incredible oratory. I consider myself to be a student of Dr. Martin Luther King, even though I never had the opportunity to meet him like some in this congregation did. For me, I have studied Dr. Martin Luther King's sermons. I have watched documentaries about the struggles of Dr. King throughout the South for civil rights and for integration. I've studied his leadership style and the nonviolence, that he was a promoter of nonviolence, is something that has inspired me in my life. And this message of Dr. King is something that can speak to each of us. If me, as a white boy from the Midwest, can be inspired by Dr. Martin Luther King, years after he had passed, imagine how this community can be transformed by that prophetic message. I think that one of the things that I ask myself is, what can I do to keep Dr. Martin Luther King's dream alive? And what can we do as a church? One of the few churches that was blessed with his presence. What can we do to keep his dream alive today? There are two essential elements to keeping Dr. King's dream alive. He spoke after delivering his sermon here. He went to Canoga Park High School and he spoke about the future of integration. Now, 50 years later, we must ask ourselves, have we achieved full racial integration in our society? Have we achieved integration in our churches? The truth is that this hour on Sunday morning is still considered one of the most segregated hours of the week. It's hard work to bring together diverse communities, but it must continue. And we must acknowledge that there have been advances. There have been advances since my generation. When I went to elementary school, I was blessed to meet 4 African American students who, because of federal integration, desegregation, and the busing, were brought to my elementary school. Without that effort of desegregation, I never would have met Nate, or Natasha, or Roche, or Rudy. They were the first black students that I met who were brought into my school. Now, there's been other advances as well. There are now laws that prohibit discrimination in terms of voting and in the workplace or in housing. If a black couple were to buy discrimination. So that is a significant advance. But the other aspect of Dr. Martin Luther King's dream that was often forgotten is his dedication to economic justice. Economic justice was what Dr. King dedicated himself to during the final years of his life, because he saw with a prophetic vision that the path to integration was moving forward. They were having achievements, but he saw that it would not be enough just to eliminate the labels on drinking fountains or bathrooms. If people who were African American or people of color did not have access to resources to bridge the gap of inequality, they would still be separate and unequal. And to this day, have we moved forward in achieving more economic equality in our country? We're actually having a greater disparity of wealth than there was during Dr. King's time. So there's much work that must continue. That is our work of this church and of this upcoming generation. But I'd like to share with you one of the aspects of Dr. King's prophetic vision that I think you could bring into your life. Dr. King spoke with a kind of prophetic vision that was not just the kind where you might be able to predict something that will happen, and if it happens, you think, wow, this guy can see the future. Dr. King's prophetic speech was more like asking, what is it that is our deepest desire? What is a vision for what is the society and the community that we long for? And then how can we make that happen? It was called prophetic promotion. So if we think of ourselves, each of us has the capacity to be a prophet. And I'm going to give you a simple acronym for how you can realize that in your life. It's called How to Soar. You begin with the S of speaking the truth. Speaking the truth in your life. You continue with the O of overcoming resistance. If you find yourself compelled to speak the truth, you may find that there is some resistance that you will find to your message. Finally, the A is to aspire to inspire with your words. Aspire to inspire. It doesn't mean that it'll happen automatically, but with that as your intention, you know that you can speak with a prophetic voice. And finally, the R of soar is to rely on God. To rely on God. Now, I don't want you to misinterpret this message and think that, there's different ways that you can speak the truth that may not match this prophetic criteria. Somebody here may be inspired in the lineup after church to come to me and say, Pastor Sam, I felt compelled to speak the truth. I want you to know that your tie didn't really match your outfit. It's a little crooked, and you may want to look into a better wardrobe. Now, that may be speaking the truth. But did that meet the criteria of aspiring to inspire? Not so much. Now, if you can tell me where I can find a new suit and 10 ties for under $40, now that is an inspiring message. So we must aspire, when we speak the truth, to inspire people with a vision, and then rely on God to point the way. When we bring this type of prophetic speaking into our lives, we can find the power to change the world. When we speak like Dr. Martin Luther King, with a love for ourselves, a concern for others, and a connection and a love of God, we can change the world. Now, I want to give you a taste of what it would be like to speak prophetically as a member of this church. So I'd like to invite those of you who are here today to give it a little try and to say with me a prophetic message. How about say with me now and repeat after me, this church, can change lives.
can change lives.
This church can save lives.
Can save lives.
Now, that's pretty good. At first, it may just be reciting some words. But part of prophetic speaking is to speak something until you believe it. Try it now like you believe it. This church can change lives.
Can change lives.
This church
This
can save lives.
church can save lives.
Now, I want to share with you why I believe this to be true. When I say that this church can change lives and that this church can save lives, I'm not talking about some doctrine that if you believe it, that you'll have pie in the sky and go to heaven. When I say this church can change lives and save lives, I'm talking about ministries of this church that can make a difference in people's lives and give them a reason for living. I'll give you 3 examples. The first are the 12-step programs that are nestled here in this church. When there are people who are caught up in the throes of addiction or have family members who are suffering from addiction, and they know that they can come to this church and gather in this chapel on any day of the week and find hope for a change, we're saving lives. I'll share with you another example. When we had our Christmas pageant here at the church this year, there was a diverse gathering of people, including many newcomers who had not normally come to the church. And I saw that there was a couple that came who were a lesbian couple and came to enjoy the church service. Now, as the voices were singing and as the stories were being told, one of them was moved to tears. And the welcome that she received from a long-term member of our church was a tap on the shoulder with a tissue. This was from someone who could have been her grandmother. This was from someone who could have judged or made assumptions, but instead just offered comfort. By proclaiming that we are a church that is open and affirming of gay and lesbian and bisexual and transgender, queer and questioning individuals, we are changing lives. We could be saving lives because there are more suicides among people who have been taught to hate themselves by churches. So by being a church that is welcoming, we're providing a place where my sister can come and know that she is loved. Now, another way, and probably the most profound way that this church can save lives and can change lives, is by making youth the priority. This is part of the radical vision that's motivating this church as we evaluate what are our priorities. And if you think about it, one of the greatest dreams of Dr. King was for a world where little black girls and little white girls could come together and play in harmony. Now we are a generation later. We must ask ourselves, are we closer to a world where our children, the next generation, will live together in harmony and peace? I have to say that hasn't been my experience growing up in the generation after Dr. King. But I still believe that that vision of hope for a better world is at the core of our mission as a church. And I still believe that one of the greatest acts of hope that we can have is to say to children, come and be part of this community. Here's a safe place where you are loved just as you are. Here is a place where you can come together and learn how to carry on the tradition and the vision of Dr. Martin Luther King. So as I think about that vision, I believe that this church can change lives. And I am motivated in my life and in my ministry to build a church that is trying to achieve a beloved community, a place that is open and affirming to gay and lesbian members of our community so that my sister feels welcome. I aspire and dream to build a church that is multicultural and multiracial and multilingual so that my beautiful wife, Elizabeth Gonzalez, can feel welcome and know that her tradition is valued and respected. I dream of a church and a ministry that is accessible to all, that is welcoming of those who are differently abled, so that those, like my brother-in-law Yayo, who some of you may have met with Down syndrome, are welcomed and embraced in the community, rather than viewed with suspicion or misunderstanding. This is part of the vision of the United Church of Christ, to be a church also that is theologically diverse, where we know that God is still speaking to us in various ways, and a church where we can work for a just peace. A peace not only that can bring about an end of conflict, but that has justice, where there's economic opportunity for all, and where we can hope that for the next generation there will be an end to the perpetual wars that we live through. So I invite you, as you go forth today, to be inspired by the words of a poem written by Elizabeth Hoadley called Aspire to Inspire. She writes, "There is a flame that burns in our hearts that is capable of lighting the night. There is a purpose that guides our hearts and souls. Follow it with delight. And when at the end of the day you rest, remember these words and become your best. Aspire to inspire," our elders would say. Do your best every day. And now I invite you to sing a song of response, the famous anthem, "We Shall Overcome," and sing it with some spirit.